Good morning, Chevy Chase, Washington otherwise. Good afternoon, London and Paris. And good afternoon also, good early evening, Beirut. It is great to have this wonderful combination of brilliant minds join me this week for my 20th e-policy circle of Beirut Institute Summit in Abu Dhabi. It's a wonderful conversation because it's timely that promises to take a very huge tour from the elections, US elections, into the Middle East, into the accomplishments of the past and the aspirations for the future. As usual, we will start with 4 minutes to each of the speakers to bring to us what they want us to learn, and then we engage in a conversation for the next hour. I will start with Sir Jeremy Greenstock. I'll give you 4 minutes, and please go ahead, enlighten us.
Thank you, Raghida, and congratulations on what you've achieved so far with the Policy Circle. It's a very interesting seminar room. I hope we can get together in 3D at some stage in the future.
Yes.
I'd like to build on Policy Circle 19, Raghida, when Carl Bildt and others talked about the advances in identity politics and social and political polarization in the world, which is, I think, the big trend at the moment. I want to add 3 big factors to that conversation. The first of those is the fading of the international institutions in their effectiveness. The habit of collective agreements and collective discussion has diminished over the past few years. And policy is increasingly made in national capitals in ad hoc ways, usually putting national interests first. And there's an opportunity in that for nations, but too many people are being selfish in their approach from capitals. The second big factor is the tendency for this period to create vacuums in the absence of norms being followed. The constraints on selfish or unruly behavior are too weak at the moment. There's a vacuum also, I think, in America first exceptionalism, because the US has partly withdrawn from collective approaches or involvement in keeping international order. And that's been noticeable not least in the Middle East, but there are other areas where the US has seemed to withdraw from UN institutions, for instance. And thirdly, I find that the Policy Circle tends to focus on what governments are doing and what policymakers are doing and what's happening in capitals. But the popular voice has grown stronger since the advent of greater freedom and social media and digital communication. And so the gap between governments and their own peoples has become a big theme of this current era and is growing wider. And as the world gets more unpredictable, shall we say, I think insecurity grows, and the politics of insecurity is different from the politics of a secure world. And new technology and the COVID virus have increased the general feeling of insecurity as jobs in particular disappear. So my conclusion from that is that competition is growing in the world between nations, even between individuals and organizations. And that competition risks turning into conflict, which must be avoided, obviously, in an era of such powerful weaponry. Those that possess resources will tend to move ahead. Those that are losing out will tend to lose further in this sort of crisis period, and that's very dangerous. And we must discuss what policymakers do about that, because there's no substitute for dialogue and communication, even about radically different approaches. No country can go it alone and still succeed. New partnerships are going to be necessary in business, in international relationships, even with people our country disagrees with, we disagree with. So leaders need to move out of their comfort zones, because this is no longer their familiar world, And we need the kind of leadership that understands that and reacts differently from the tendency to knee-jerk populism, nationalism at the moment. That's what I think we should be discussing.
Thank you very much, Jeremy Greenstock. There's a lot to talk about, dissect in what you said, including what you, if you distinguish between insecurity and instability, or is it the same? But we will do that during the discussion. I'll go now to Nassif Hitti. 4 minutes to you, Nassif Hitti, please.
Thank you. Let me make very few remarks first about my country, Lebanon, and the Middle East. And what we could see, Lebanon has never been influential in the region. It has been most of the time a playground rather than a player in regional affairs. They always have a price of all forms of conflicts in the region. In this region, we're back to what I call a very disordered regional order. We're witnessing regional civil war, where people from a country are fighting in another country within transnational solidarities. So the nation state was not consolidated. It was broken down in a way. Adding to that, the economic crisis with its social repercussions. So it's really a very difficult, disordered regional order in which we feel we're living today. At the international level, I think the rise of illiberal values, perhaps as a reaction of fear or phobias against successive waves of globalization, is again reviving the concept of identity in its worst form, sometimes in the forms of phobias, of hating the other next door. Nation states are not, no more, the nations are not fitting with the nation states they are in a different part of the world. And this is a main source of challenge and threat. And we need to find new ways of cooperative behavior and cooperation to install in order to be able to address these matters. Again, the Middle East is a terrain fertile, as we say in French, is a very interesting, unfortunately, to put it this way, place to study these phenomena. When I talk about a regional Cold War, I could talk also about a regional civil war, where, as I'm saying, people from one country are fighting in another country for different identity-based slogans. So the nation, the concept of the Ummah is different, doesn't apply to what we've learned, what we work with or live with, and this creates more tension and more instability at the larger level. We could see today in the Middle East 2 important hotspots, East Mediterranean from Libya, from Tripoli of Libya to Tripoli of Lebanon, as a source of fighting, all kind of fighting going on, of transnational solidarities in terms of fighting, and the Gulf, how things are changing. We need to develop new tools to address these problems because we have new challenges and different forms of conflict in front of us.
Thank you very much, Nassif Hitti. We're going to go now to Terje Rød-Larsen. And 4 minutes to you, Terje Rød-Larsen.
Thank you very much, Raghida. It's a pleasure being with you, as always. And let me topics which Jeremy pinpointed. And I will start with the Middle East. In the Middle East, you have, it's the only region in the world where you don't have a regional organization which encompasses all the countries of the region, friends and foes. You have the Arab League, which is pretty dysfunctional now because of the Qatar, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE conflict. You have the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is marred by the same conflict. You have the Maghreb Union, which actually never functioned. And there is no organization in this region which encompasses all the Arabs, the Turkeys, the Iranians, and the Israelis. One very positive, in my opinion, development lately has been that the UAE and Bahrain, I know the Sudan, has established relations with Israel. But we have to create one table where everybody's sitting, including the Turks, including the Iranians, and including the Israelis. If this is not done, I don't think we will get out of the crisis in the Middle East. And this is deeply in the European interest, because if you look at the demographics here, Egypt's population will double within 2050. If you go back to 1950, the population of Africa had half the population of Europe. In 2050, Africa will have 2/3 of the population in Europe. So what we've seen of immigration crises over the last few years is just the beginning of a massive crisis for Europe. So all this has to be addressed, and the only way to go, as I see it, is through multilateralism. And here I'm underlining what Jeremy said, but it has also to be done through the establishment of a regional mechanism for the Middle East and North Africa, which will also, I think, will be the only possibility to stem a further influx of refugees from the developments with Bahrain and the UAE, I think, is the most positive developments which has happened in the Middle East over several decades. And I think the Palestinian leadership's interpretation of it is deeply misunderstood. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to take many things up with you, but I need to first go to Edward Lotwick. But you know, and as far as the Palestinians are concerned, they feel they were left out. And as far as this very interesting regional mechanism that you're talking about, I just want to know what time frame you have in mind, Terje Rød-Larsen, because it seems to me totally premature given the relationship between all the players, and including Israel's continued occupation, refusal to have the two-state solution, but not to forget Iran's project in the region, Turkey's project. How on earth are you thinking that this is going to be surmounted, and within what time frame, Terje Rød-Larsen?
Thank you, Raghida. Well, I'm just stating what I think is necessary. I'm not a planner for timeframes, but I think this is absolutely necessary to do. But it's up to the players in the region and beyond to decide what the time frame is. I cannot determine that.
All right, Edward Lotwick, 4 minutes to you. Just take it from here and say what you want to say, and then get back if you want to some of the points made. I'm sure that Nassif Hitti would want to make some comments on what Terje Rød-Larsen said, but we'll do this after we listen to you. Edward Lotwick, 4 minutes to you, please.
Well, this morning's news is that Tehran has suddenly discovered the UN resolutions that favor Azerbaijan. What's happening is that the Azeris of Western Iran, the ones who are still Azeris, who speak Azeri, have rebelled. And Iran is just about the last multinational state. It's ripe for breaking up. The Tehran authorities this morning decided that they don't want to risk. So things are moving under the surface, and on top of all of it, not very much not under the surface, is the shift of conflictuality. Sorry about this. Shift of conflictuality from the Atlantic and Middle East to East Asia. Conflictuality line is now the periphery of China, vis-a-vis Vietnam, Japan, and Australia, India, and the United States. So the main power is shifted over there. This means that France, for example, can be a significant military power, very significant, by using the British bases in Cyprus, which the British are very happy to let them have. They're investing some money to upgrade them. So Macron can step in and stop Erdogan's attempt to sort of dominate the Eastern Mediterranean with his cardboard navy. Because now we move to the second fact, which is that in the underlying change of the military balance of power, as I think people do understand, sort of cardboard forces like the Turks have can only function if none of the serious people intervene against them. So what we have in Turkey, however, is not an explosion, but a resolution, because as you all know, domestic support for Erdogan and his neo-Ottoman project has been declining in every election. and the next one, it will go. So Turkey will still remain a very important country, but not one adventuring across the place. In their role as an important country, it would continue to balance Iran. Now, as for the recommendation from Terje Rød-Larsen, that could be dismissed as a fantasy in the past. That is no longer the case. And it's no longer the case because if you go down country by country, every one of them has one reason to have such an organization. I don't include the Palestinians in that because the Palestinian record of the last century is very consistent. And it can change, of course, we can all change, but their consistent record is that they cannot fight wars and they cannot make peace. Whenever peace came near, it had to be kicked back with things like uprisings, intifadas, and so on. So the exclusion of the Palestinians from the current peacemaking is not some sort of a willful desire to keep these unfortunate people from their rights, but the impossibility of doing anything with them. If they get into the car doesn't drive. People do want to drive. And apart from the ones you heard about, there is, of course, Morocco, and in reality, there's everybody else. So I believe that the Middle East will benefit enormously from the fact that the axis of conflictuality moves away, and it makes it at least theoretically possible to reestablish the Lebanon that in reality, every country in the region would like to have. The stable, internally balanced Lebanon, which had all kinds of pressures but contained them, and which provided a platform for everybody, and everybody wants it back.
Thank you very much. I think we are going to engage in the controversial points made by Terje Rød-Larsen to begin with. Let's start with Jeremy Greenstock. What do you think about this proposal of Terje Rød-Larsen? And why on earth are the Palestinians? Why is everyone feeling that the Palestinians are fine if excluded? Yes, they made mistakes, but my goodness, this people suffered. And they have been under occupation, and thanks to the British history that brought about a lot of misery to the Palestinians, not alone. Obviously, there's been Arab contribution, Palestinian contribution, of course, American and Israeli. So let's take up these points right now with Jeremy Greenstock. Tell me quickly, what do you think of this proposal? Is it a fantasy, or is it really a new, an innovative way to take a look at things?
I entirely agree with Terje that there needs to be dialogue in the Middle East, going beyond the Arabs. The Arabs are not even talking well amongst themselves. As he says, the Arab League is dysfunctional. But I don't think we can move at an early date to a discussion of something like the Organization of Security and Cooperation in the Middle East, to copy Europe. I think one of the models that the Middle East should think about, to include the Turkish, Iranians and Israelis, should be closer to ASEAN rather than to Europe, where they talk about trade and economics and infrastructure before they talk about security. And then they develop a security subcommittee off that, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and get into some of the security questions. Life and conflict is too raw at the moment for that to happen soon, but there does need to be dialogue, and we can talk about that further.
Yeah.
As for the Palestinians, we have to face a cruel and difficult fact, which is that the Palestinian administration is in effect in league with Israel to continue the occupation, because that serves the vested interests of the Palestinian leadership. Yes, they've been denied an opportunity for a full negotiation. Yes, the Arabs have deserted them. Yes, the international community have to some extent built a unified position that is clear enough or united enough to deserve the attention of the outside world here.
Yeah, I think I think it's a bit cruel, Jeremy Greenstock. I mean, I agree with the analysis, but after all, they have been under an occupation by Israel, supported by the United States, by the United Kingdom, by the world. At any rate, I think Nassif Hitti would want to come in on this, especially everybody calling the Arab League dysfunctional. You were the ambassador of the Arab League to many places. So, well, Nassif Hitti, to you.
Let me make two remarks. First, absolutely, it's this that I've argued many times in the past, what opened the doors, particularly for Turkey and Iran, for a return of Turkey and Iran under the Islamist, pan-Islam slogan, was the weakening of the Arab League and the power vacuum created by this weakening. But let me pick up on one point. Regardless of what we think about the balance of power and the fact that the Palestinian leadership has done that and that, I think like any people in the world, the Palestinian their own nation state, to have their own nation state in the West Bank and Gaza, as we have agreed, as I have spoken of that. And this will allow to inject a strong shot, in realistic strong shot in the region, and allow for stabilization, and not to allow for use and misuse by many powers, Arab and non-Arab powers, of the Palestinian issue for different purposes. I'm not only saying a typical balance of power should allow that, allowing them to have their nation state. Nobody is perfect, no leadership is perfect, and not allowing for revisionist policies such as the policy of Israel in the West Bank and other places would be extremely helpful. And this will allow for a new opening to go for a conference on security and cooperation in the Middle East. By the way, Raghida, I've argued in 2014 in an article, co-signed with an Iranian colleague, Mousavian at that time, and that was an argument I made in a conference about the importance of having a conference on security and cooperation at the beginning, having the Arab countries, Iran and Turkey, to establish sort of healthcare process. The main problem in the Arab world and East is that you have governments which speaks over the head of other governments. We have to have a sort of neo-Westphalian system. It's not for me to decide as government what should be the good government of the other country. So this injection, supranational element, using transnational ideologies in the region, is extremely hurting and extremely destabilizing in the region.
Let me ask you a quick question. You were a foreign minister for Lebanon. Do you think Lebanon can, or does it matter? Is Lebanon irrelevant when it comes to such a discussion about the larger picture of having the Arabs, all the Arabs, Turkey, Iran, Israel, under one, what did we call it? What did Terje call it? Mechanism, regional mechanism. Do you think Lebanon would have a say? Would you have advised it? If you were still in office and someone came up with this issue, with this idea, whether it's something you had in mind or whether Terje Rød-Larsen, what would you do?
The day I assumed my functions as Minister of Foreign Affairs, I made the argument about the importance of having Lebanon being a firefighter or contributing to a group of countries that could be a firefighter, with a firefighter role in the region. We have all interest in seeing stability, in seeing a sort of rule of law, a sort of, again, Westphalian system. We could have differences, countries, but we don't have the right to speak over the head of other countries. And that the danger in the Middle East is using certain transnational identities, whether sectarian, ethnic, religious, or others, in order to give ourselves the right to speak as government over the head of other government. We have seen this practice by Turkey, by Iran, and by others in the region. We need to normalize the relationship, to have interstate relationship, and then to see how to manage conflicts and to build on cooperation and find possibilities of cooperation among different states.
Terje Rød-Larsen, you had a very important think tank, International Peace Institute, and you are in touch with major players in the Arab region, leaders in the Arab region, and probably also definitely in Israel and Turkey most likely, but I don't know if you still are well connected with Iran. I know you visited Iran. But have you come up with this idea based on prior conversation that you felt that there is readiness for this to be launched? Or is it in sort of like a testing ground and you're just going to throw it out there and we see specifically that you've been very critical of the regime in Tehran and that you have said in the past that it is the raison d'etre of this regime to have its own project regionally. Terje Rød-Larsen.
I've been promoting this idea of establishing a mechanism or an organization for the region for many, many years. And I've had the pleasure of sitting with my good friend, the Iranian foreign minister, to discuss it. And actually, he agrees, with the exception of Israel.
Well, then
that it is necessary to have a mechanism.
Purpose, no? I mean, if there is an exception of Israel, then it's a different regional structure. They were talking about the Iranians, about the GCC.
Raghida, I'm not arguing. I'm not arguing with you. I'm just telling you what he told me. Okay? So, because, I mean, you don't make peace between friends. You make peace between friends and enemies. And you have to have everybody around the table. And this is one of the reasons why Europe is as peaceful as it is today, because you have the Council of Europe, you have the European Union, you have other mechanisms in Europe where everybody's sitting by the table, including Russia and the old Soviet Eastern European states. And this is one of the reasons why this is functioning. I mean, there are disagreements, there are conflicts, there are power struggles, that's everything. But in the Middle East, it's the only region in the world where everybody's not sitting at the same table. So this is why the policy of the empty chair, as I call it, hasn't functioned. And this is why I applaud the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and now the Sudan, who are sitting at the table with Israel. There are huge issues here. There are huge differences of interests, but at least they're sitting at the same table. And I think that Egypt and Jordan, listen, Raghida, Egypt and Jordan have been the most efficient Arab partners for the Palestinians because they could talk to the Israelis. And this is why go to the table, fill the empty chairs, create a mechanism whereby everybody can talk, including Iran, including Turkey.
All right, well, I still am going to tell you that lofty and somehow, you know, I mean, I know the Iranians have put forward systematically an interesting proposal of theirs, which I find that it has a purpose that serves Iran, which is to basically have the GCC countries plus Iran plus Iraq into a new regional structure mechanism. And that has been really not met in any welcomed way by the Arab region, or especially by the GCC, because they felt this would be a dismantling of the GCC to open it up and have the security structure where Iran will be the one who holds the biggest cards. And plus we have heard proposals by Russia, similar proposals by Russia to say the new regional security structure. Edward Lutwit, do you want to address this new regional structure? Where do we go from here?
I like your point.
No, you said it's a lofty thing, but I mean, is it? How would you think Iran and Turkey would do with this? I mean, this is the least problematic problem, but Iran-Israel is a huge problem. Arabs-Israel is a semi-problem or a problem. But what about Turkey, Iran?
First of all, Turkey, don't speak of Turkey as a parameter, because as you know, the politics in Turkey are changing. Erdogan lost Istanbul, he lost Ankara, and the next election is going to lose Turkey. Turkey will not disappear, but the neo-Ottoman project will be drastically diminished. As for Iran, Iran's, big power role and so on is built on the basis of a miserable economy, which was caused already a lot of rioting by people complaining in the streets of Tehran that you're running an empire with the economy of a small country. And therefore, there are constraining mechanisms. But in regard to the proposal, the important proposal, please notice how these things really work out. ASEAN was mentioned. ASEAN started when 3 of its parties were practically at war with each other. Nevertheless, they set it up. Once they set it up, they discovered it was very useful to resolve problems between various parties within it, which before had no mechanism. For example, let's assume you persuade Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia to join into this organization. Can this organization then solve the problems of the world? Probably not. But it would give a framework so the Moroccans and the Algerians could resolve their problems, and the Tunisians, etc. In other words, once you start this machine, I'm sympathetic to the idea of building the structure and then allowing the different lateral substance into it. I think it's a strong proposal.
All right, so let's move away from this because I don't want to spend the whole hour talking about that. Let me ask you, why do you think Erdogan, who looks mighty right now, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, why do you think, or at least you're insinuating that he's not there to stay? Although the impression he gives is that he is, like he's mighty. And even Vladimir Putin is
soap opera. It's soap opera. It's not the reality. Because one of the things Erdogan has not done is to keep the promise he made to his original supporters, that he would ride democracy only until he brought him to an Islamic Turkey, and then he would get off the bus. Well, he hasn't kept that promise. There was an election in his base, which is Istanbul.
Yeah.
Remember, he starts with a football club, football hooligans is the base. He loses Istanbul, he's lost Ankara, he's lost Antalya, he's lost every place in Turkey where people don't go around with big mustaches. And everywhere in Turkey where they shave their mustache and use deodorant, don't vote for Erdogan. And Turkey is mixing, fewer and fewer people have mustaches, more and more use deodorants, and then don't vote for Erdogan. So Turkey is resolving its own problem. There are too many educated people in Turkey to allow Erdogan's neo-Ottoman soap opera to continue.
All right. Okay. Let's move on. I'm going to go backward now in terms of the order that I started. I'm going to go back to Terje Rød-Larsen. What is the Iran that you see now in this particular time? The Iran of today and its functional policies in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, on the internal level, and within the U.S. In the context of the U.S. relationship, whether it's with President Trump, if he continues to be president, or with Joe Biden, the vice president, if he becomes president. Could you discuss Iran with me, Terje Rød-Larsen? I feel it's shifting.
Thank you, Raghida. No, I can't go into the heads of American politicians and say what they are thinking. But if you look at the broader picture in the region, if you go back a couple of decades, the center of gravity of everything in the region was the Israeli-Arab conflict. This is no longer the case. This has been moved, unfortunately, into the periphery. The Palestinian people deserve justice, they deserve a state, they deserve identity, but unfortunately, it's been pushed into the periphery of the minds of the peoples and the leaders of the region and the world. And the center of gravity in the region now is as it is perceived, and I'm not saying if it's correct or not, but this is the perception, is that it's an Arab-Iranian conflict, and it's a Sunni-Shia conflict. And this is the center of gravity in the region as it is perceived. This is most unfortunate, but this is the way it is perceived. But this brings me back to my main point. What is important now is to bring the Iranians to the table, to bring them into a regional mechanism where everything can be discussed, and to find peaceful solutions to all the conflicts which are raging the region, from Yemen to Libya and beyond.
Terje Rød-Larsen, Iran is on the record. The Iranian leadership is on the record to say that no way Israel is the enemy. So are you, I mean, again, where is this coming from? You said you've been speaking to your friend, the foreign minister, Zarif, who was, we all know him still, Jeremy Greenstock, remember him when he was the ambassador at the UN? Mohammed Jawad Zarif, I'm sure you remember him from that time. But where are you, Terje Rød-Larsen, seeing there is an interest by Iran now to ease up with Israel?
Actually, Raghida Zarif, who I know very well from his time at the UN, has exactly the same opinions as I have.
What?
That everybody has to sit at the table, with the exception of, listen, Raghida, with the exception of Israel.
Yeah,
and we need Israel at the table as well. Not only Turkey and Iran, we need Israel at the table as well.
How do you
so this is how civilized people resolve conflicts. They sit at the same table. I mean, there's no use to negotiate peace between Sweden and Switzerland, but we have to get the foes to sit at the same table. And the foes here in the region are, on the one side, some of the key Sunni Arab states, and Iran, Turkey, and until recently, Israel. But this has now got to be resolved. So we need everybody to be at the table, including Iran.
May I remind you that the whole Iranian discovery of Israel was part of a project where Iran becomes the leader of the Middle East, because it doesn't matter that they are not Sunni, but Shia, because they hate the Jews more. That's why they went into the Holocaust story and all that. Secondly, they said, it doesn't matter that we are not Arabs, but Farsi, so to speak, because we hate the state of Israel more than you. We hate Jews more than you, and we hate the state of Israel more than you. Therefore, you can accept our leadership. That project failed. It failed. It cost them a lot of money. It failed. When the people go in the streets in Isfahan and demonstrate, is they're saying, it was a good idea, it didn't work, stop it. That's why I believe the things are really changing.
All right, let me go to Nassif Hitti. Nassif Hitti, let's just move on. Again, I don't want to get stuck with this idea. Talk to me about the demarcation talks that are happening, the maritime demarcation, that the talks between Lebanon and Israel right now. How fundamentally important are these? Are they part of that process of easing up within the context of what's on the mind of Terje Rød-Larsen? It seems that, you know, when people are ready to talk, then things could go places. And by the way, I want to go back to Terje Rød-Larsen and speak about the blue line after I hear from Nassif Hitti and Terje Greenstock.
I'm sorry, very, very briefly, before Terje perhaps will pick up on the blue line issue, the time has come to sit and discuss under the UN flag of the demarcation of the maritime borders. It's very important. It was expected, it should have happened. But as you know, like in other countries, also in Lebanon, sometimes external affairs are part of domestic politicking concerning the timing of launching this process. I would have expected it to start before, and we should engage into this matter sooner than later.
And are you for the demarcation not to be exclusively maritime, that it should be land demarcation as well, not only with Israel, but also with Syria, Nassif Hitti?
My view has always been, before I became minister, and I was minister, and after that, we must demarcate all frontiers or lines, whether with Israel or even before that, with the Syrians. Things must be cleared here just to address a basic source of tension that could be used and misused again and again for a different purpose. Now, whether we can do it or not, that's another story. As you know, Lebanon, as I keep saying, it's a terrain it's a playground of different kinds of conflicts in the region. Unfortunately for us as Lebanese, who have been paying a very heavy price for that for two reasons: the weakness of the state as itself, and the ideological, political, and other solidarities between sometimes part of a certain national component of Lebanon with a certain particular political power in the region. We've seen that in our modern history. The actors changed, but the principle is always there. This kind of transnational really solidarities. This is a key problem in the Middle East. We are not talking about normal states having normal differences. We're talking about sometimes states that allow themselves for ideological reason to speak over the heads of other states and say, I have solidarities with a component of your society because of sectarian reason, because of ideological reason, or religious reason, or ethnic reason sometimes. And that's a key issue that we need to address at the base.
Nassif, Hitti, is anybody, is Saad al-Hariri the PM, designated PM, Saad al-Hariri, has he spoken to you about coming back to serve as a minister in the new government?
Nobody has spoken to me.
Hitti?
I'm with you on the program now, so my phone is off. No, nobody has spoken to me about that matter. Raghida, I was very clear. I don't want to abuse.
Because you see, let me tell you why.
When I was a minister, I advised. I just want to say, I advise about having what I call an active, positive neutrality situation in Lebanon. All our problems in Lebanon basically were instigated, not that we don't have domestic problems, from alliances here and there with regional actors at one point of time. This is why our domestic problems are, externally provoked political problem that we ourselves as Lebanese, fall into.
You mean neutrality as proposed by the Patriarch Rai? Is this what you mean? Are you saying we need to endorse the proposal?
Positive neutrality, meaning not taking side, but sometimes if there is an issue, which is an issue that fits 100% international law, that a country's borders are being violated, I will go for that. Let me give you an example. I was criticized by some factions in Lebanon when I condemned the attack of the Houthis against Saudi Arabia. I said, I'm not talking about different regional actors being involved in Yemen, but I'm saying about a country being attacked. These are some basic principles that you have to abide by.
Yeah. But you didn't tell me, sorry, just to be clear, because we didn't understand, there was a bad connection. You are endorsing the proposal by Patriarch Al-Rai for neutrality of Lebanon, yes or no?
It's called, yes, well, the proposal, to be clear, it's about positive neutrality. Positive neutrality. It's a political matter, not legal matter as it's, it's known in the word. That we don't side entirely, for instance, like we're taking today in the confrontation in the region into de facto situation of being part of a certain bloc by certain factions in Lebanon.
Jeremy Greenstock, I bet you want to say something on Lebanon before you say whatever you are ready to bring to us. Can you, I know that there is, in your family, there is a love for this country. I know that. So do you think it's already written off? Will you write off this country given where we are with such corruption, with a situation where there's no real independence, if you will, with the paramilitary force aligned with another capital, with all the disasters of the economy and otherwise? Jeremy Greenstock.
Raghida, yes, I weep for Lebanon. It's such a lovely country, and the people are such lovely people. They've not been served well by the elite, by their governance. Raghida, we have to recognize that the standard of governance in the region we're talking about is not the highest in the world. The Arab peoples are perhaps the people who are seeing their talent potential and their actuality. They have not been well served by their governments. And Lebanon is a bitter example of that. But of course, we're dealing with the intrusion into the older Lebanese compromise arrangement of Hezbollah under their Iranian influence. So it is extraordinarily difficult to deal with. And they are being, Hezbollah in particular, completely irresponsible in terms of their mission for the people of Lebanon. But let's talk about something a bit wider, which we haven't talked about, which is very important, which is that the #1 priority of every government in this region is to preserve its own power domestically. As I said, the gap between peoples and governments is the big theme of this era. It's growing wider, and governments are getting more desperate about holding on to power.
Yeah.
There is a mutuality, even within a region like the Middle East, for governments to work together to hold on to decent governance and to their position as the regime responsible for their peoples. They need to talk to each other about this. They need to think about growing their economies together. After all, every conflict that's coming out of the Middle East is coming out of an internal situation. In Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, it comes out of an internal situation. It's under the surface, in Algeria, and elsewhere. They need to talk to each other about this. This is what Javad Zarif really wants. The Iranian #1 priority is to keep its people under the regime's thumb. Through their rotten governance, of course, but that they're not territorially aggressive. They don't want to kill everybody else in the Middle East. They don't want to take over any other territory. They want to control their own people.
Well, I mean, it's no, they want to control other people, Sir Jeremy Greenstock. I mean, the control of Lebanon is not a picnic. It's
they've had vacuums to move into.
Sovereignty of a country, and especially you were in Iraq. I'm going to come to you, Edward Lotworth, right now. But you were in Iraq, Jeremy Greenstock, and you know what? The contributions, the likes of the UK and the US invasion and occupation of Iraq has contributed greatly to the way these societies have become the dysfunctional countries that they are, the misery in which Iraq is now, or Lebanon, or, I mean, you know, there's been an enabling, a systematic enabling by the UK and other countries. Why can't you take responsibility, at least partially, for where things have gone south?
You haven't asked me.
Right, well,
the era of conflict in the Middle East started with the Iran-Iraq war. That's what set Sunni and Shia against each other. And the American invasion, the American-British invasion of Iraq furthered that, made that situation worse. It was the first breakout of the Arab Spring, was in Iraq, not Egypt or Tunisia or Libya, it was in Iraq. And of course we left a vacuum of order there because the Americans wouldn't take the responsibility for security. Read my book, I've taken responsibility for that. But what we must talk about now is proper policy formulation of the idea of dialogue and communication and mutuality in the Middle East, because if they don't do that, the region is going to go backwards.
All right, Jeremy Greenstock, one day we're going to dedicate a whole hour to see how did things go so bad by the international community in places like Iraq, in places like Syria. But Edward Lotworth wants to come in now, and I'm sure he's got a lot to say on these issues. Go ahead, Edward.
Well, a country that develops ballistic missiles and tries to have nuclear warheads and says that it's to attack Israel is not a non-aggressive country. But in regard to the demarcation talks between Lebanon and Israel, in the old days, each side would try to burn the other's natural gas facilities. Now they want to develop it side by side. But overall, since I've traveled all over Lebanon with a Jeep, but I can tell you that Lebanon is the victim of divine justice, is divine justice. God sees how people live in Riyadh and Kuwait, and then goes to Lebanon and they see how they live, what the landscape looks like, what the food is like, and the sea, and you go to Jebel and you water ski there, and it's divine justice. The Lebanese got all of this, they can't have good government as well. It's like Italians, the same thing. It appears to be contingent on this or that, but they're condemned to it. And the resolution was to have less government. And that is the future that the world would want for Lebanon would be lower key, more going back to quieter, more distributed, decentralized government, and so on. Iran is running out of money no matter what, and therefore Hezbollah is getting less and less, as you know.
China is looking up for that.
Sorry?
China is looking up for the money.
The Chinese are not going to finance Hezbollah, not in 1,000 years. The Chinese in the Middle East have never played that role. They're not giving a dime to the Iranians or to Hezbollah. The one thing the Chinese will never do is to go against Israel. They're in Israel, they're not buying high-tech companies, they're buying the dairy, milk, and yogurt company. So China is not going to play this role.
But the pact, they signed the pact, Iran and China.
Yes, the pact. Yes, they're going to develop a huge port. They're going to do, this is part of the famous Belt and Road fantasy project. This is not China. China commitment, if the Chinese are not going to commit strategically in the Middle East, because even at their low level of strategic competence, they understand that they have taken on by aligning the Australians, Vietnamese, Indians, Japanese, and Americans, they've taken on 150% of what they can take on. So don't see them supporting Iran. That is a fantasy.
Thank you very much, Edward Luttwak. Terje Rød-Larsen, you have played a role in the Oslo Accords that promised the Palestinians something they believed. And then really, the jury was still out. Once I asked you, do you think it was a success story or a failure? You said, we will see. A lot of people feel that the trouble with Oslo is that the Palestinians believed in the promises and the Israelis never did. Do you regret this playing a role in this? Because it led to a big cost for the Palestinians, a big price.
Actually, I profoundly disagree with you, Raghida. Oslo is an ideology which is a two-state solution, which I think is now unanimously supported in the international community. There is only one way, and that is two states living peacefully side by side, and that ideology is standing. And number two, it is the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, which is still standing with Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas as president, with ministries, etc., which are administering the West Bank and partly Gaza with the issues of Hamas, etc. And then thirdly, it is the mutual recognition of the PLO and the State of Israel. These are the three elements of Oslo.
Okay.
And the alternative to Oslo is to abandon the two-state solution, and we will be backed into an impossible conflict again. And it is for the Palestinian Authority to be dismantled and the PLO to return to terrorism and go into exile again. So if you please, Raghida, I mean,
let me ask you, Terje, one second.
But if you compare with what was the situation more than 25 years ago, I mean, we are in a much better state, and the living conditions of the Palestinians are much, much better today than they were before Oslo. I'm not saying it's ideal, but it's better.
Okay, well, anyway, the deal now is the one negotiated by Jared Kushner, much more than nobody speaks about Oslo at this point. But, you know, I'm glad to hear you believe that there's still a chance for a two-state solution. I think there is.
Realities on the ground. Realities on the ground are that Israelis go to the beach, Palestinians go to the beach in Tel Aviv, and Israelis take their cars to be repaired in the Kasbah of Nablus, where they last went with tanks. Now they go and bring the car to be repaired. Oslo has changed real relationships. The Hamas exception itself is diminishing. It changed human relationships. Oslo is a giant success.
So Oslo is what? Finish that sentence. Oslo is what?
Is a giant success because in reality, Palestinians go to the beach, Israelis have their cars fixed, where before they would have to go with a tank. Oslo made that. Oslo changed the real life of people.
I gotta do something. I'm gonna be running out of time, and the electricity will be cut off. And if it does, stay put. Don't go away till I tell you, please, you're gone. You're able to leave. But listen, I never had, but I had never had anybody come in to the conversation. But I have a persistent and insistent former Arab League, the Secretary General of the Arab League. Amr Moussa, and he's a member of the board of Beirut Institute. Then I really must take him for 1 minute, please. He needs to come in. Elisa is telling me that he can't. Please, Elisa, bring him in for 1 minute only.
So we will welcome him.
Exactly. Amr Moussa, everyone is welcoming you for a minute, please. This is an exception. Okay, you're upside down. Oh. Amr Moussa, please. Okay, there you are. But please 1 minute, because we're going to finish before the electricity cuts off. Amr Moussa, you have to unmute. No, you're on mute. We cannot hear you. No. You are muted. Okay, go ahead. 1 minute. Amr Moussa, please. 1 minute. We're running out. Okay. Shall I go ahead to somebody else? Elisa, do I? All right, listen. I want, Amr Moussa, can you say something? Okay, I don't think this is going to work. If it does, we'll try to fit it in again, because I don't think it's working. Let me take you, let me do the 1 minute close. Okay, Amr Moussa, say something, please. I told you it doesn't work. Hello? Okay, I tried, forgive me. I'm sorry, I tried, I'm sorry. Sorry. Let me do the 1 minute, it's even 40 seconds, 45 seconds each. How did we, it's in the opposite order. So I'm gonna go with Edward Lotwak first, 30 seconds to you for your concluding remarks, because we have 3 minutes left, 40 seconds. Not 40
All
minutes.
historical evidence supports the Terje's idea that structure precedes the improvement of political relations. That happened in European case. They were just finished a war. They were hating each other, and they set up structure, the colon, the famous initial community colon steel. NATO, the Dutch entered NATO when every coastal hotel had a sign saying no Germans, but they entered NATO. So it's not going to be different in the Middle East. When it happens, it will precede the resolution of conflicts and not afterwards.
Thank you very much, Edward Lotwak. Now I'm going to go to Terje Rød-Larsen, 40 seconds to you, please.
No, I think Edward actually echoed my basic thoughts and my simple suggestion. And in order to make things work, so you had to do it simply. That is that everybody has to go to the table. Iranians, Israelis, Turks, and the Arabs. And if I don't do it, the chaos and anarchy in the Middle East will continue, and Europe will suffer the most. So please go to the table.
Allow for the creation of a Palestinian state and then proceed to that kind of normalcy in creating a sort of cooperative framework. One last thing I need to say, which we didn't address here because we're talking geopolitics of the region, there is a need for an inclusive social contract in most of the countries discussing about in this region, in an inclusive social contract. That's the basis of what I call societal stability.
Thank you very much, Nassif. Hitti. Jeremy Greenstock, 40 seconds, and then I have 20
seconds. The Middle East must take responsibility for their own future. They can't rely on outsiders. They've blamed outsiders for too long. Outsiders can help by suggesting ideas, by doing what Terje has been doing to try and bring them together. They must talk to each other. They must take responsibility for their own people, or they will be getting nowhere. It's getting very selfish, very conflictual at the moment. They've got to stand back and think about it. And as for the Palestinian issue, give the Palestinians equal status with the Israelis in any negotiation. Without that, you won't get a resolution.
Thank you very much, Jeremy Greenstock. I can't thank you enough for this enlightening conversation. Let me announce quickly to you who's going to be with us next week for e-Policy Circle number 21. And they are watching you, some of them anyway, and hopefully you'll watch them next week, next Wednesday. We have His Royal Highness Prince Turki Faisal. Of course, he is the co-chair of Beirut Institute Summit in Abu Dhabi, and he's the chairman of the board of the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies, and he was Saudi Arabia's director and of the General Intelligence before serving as ambassador to the UK and the US, as you know, Jeremy Greenstock. We have your friend, friend of all of ours, definitely a friend of Terje Rød-Larsen, and he is Kevin Rudd. He is former Prime Minister of Australia, currently President and CEO of Asia Society Policy. He is also the chair of the International Commission on Multilateralism and chair of the board of IPI, the institute, the board of directors, the institute that, of course, Terje Rød-Larsen heads. And we have General David Petraeus, partner KKR and chairman KKR Global Institute. He served as the fourth director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was also the commander of the International Security Assistance Force and commander of the US Central Command. This would be next Wednesday at the same time. And it's wonderful of you to join me. And I thank you most sincerely. You have a great afternoon, great evening, and thank you very much until we meet again. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye,
Bye, Raghida. I enjoyed it. I just listened in.
Bye, Terje. Bye, everybody.